Alright, today we're going to take a look at some pieces of evidence for evolution. They include things like the fossil record, anatomical evidence, physiological evidence, embryological, biochemical, universal genetic code, and biogeography. With fossil records, we look at how organisms change over time, and we establish the age of fossils through radioactive dating. With fossils, we can trace evolution of modern species from extinct ancestors. Many times we use transitional fossils to show any missing links between them. Fossils can also identify any vestigial structures that might be present, which are structures that have lost most or all of their original function. Another piece of evidence is anatomical evidence. This evidence looks at physical structures that are the same in organisms, and they also have a common ancestor. So this includes something called homologous structures, and these are going to be structures that have the same form or the same internal structure, but the structure has a different function or a purpose, and the homologous structures come from common ancestry. This occurs due to divergent evolution, as each organism fills a certain niche or a certain part of the habitat. This is an example of some homologous structures. So in this example, these are all mammals, and you can see the different colored portions that show the similarities in the bone structure for all of these. But we have a bat, which would use the limb for flying, a whale for swimming, a cat for walking, and then a human for lifting things up and for all of those functions of our arm. The other type of homologous structure we look at is vestigial structure. This is just an example of homologous because it would have come from a common ancestor. But again, vestigial structures will have lost most, if not all, of their function. Some examples of this can include the appendix, the tailbone. We have wisdom teeth. The fact that you have goosebumps would be a vestigial function. We have in whales a pelvis or a femur bone, so even though whales don't currently use that, that would have been something that perhaps their ancestors would have used. The reason why they don't disappear is because vestigial structures don't impact the fitness of the organism, so it's not selected for or against, and so the structure just remains because it doesn't increase or decrease the fitness. The other type of evidence would be physiological evidence. This is evidence that focuses on the functions of structures and the functions that are the same. So this includes analogous structures, and they're structures that have a different form or a different internal structure, but the same function, and they come from a distant ancestor rather than a common ancestor. Most of the time for analogous structures and with this physiological evidence, this occurs due to convergent evolution because the same environmental pressures are going to cause organisms to look the same. So if organisms are living in two different deserts, they will develop similarly because the adaptations that help one organism to survive in a desert will also help other organisms to survive in the desert. Some examples of homologous structures include wings of different animals, so like a butterfly and a bat. You have an insect versus a mammal, so the internal structure is different, but the overall function, which is flying, would be the same. And so whenever we see analogous structures, most of the time we're looking at big picture things like the development of swimming, so fish versus dolphins versus penguins. They all develop similar features that allow them to swim because of the same selection pressures with convergent evolution. Another piece of evidence for evolution is embryological evidence. This is showing how embryos develop in a similar pattern or a similar order and supports the idea of descent from a common ancestor. The picture that's shown is showing some vertebrates and some organisms and how they develop from a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, to a fully formed animal. Now, obviously, they change and they look different by the end, but they start off at the same point and kind of go through the same steps and the same pattern of development. Here's another example of embryological development, which shows the same idea. The next evidence for evolution is universal genetic code. So this is the idea that all organisms, extinct, living, bacteria, plants, fungi, animals, they all are going to use DNA and RNA for genetic information. We have A, T, C, and G, and then also U for uracil in our RNA. They use the same codon chart, and this really supports the idea that all organisms came from that common ancestor. We all use the same type of genetic information. It's all just changed a little bit along the way, but those little changes make a big difference. Another piece of evidence is biochemical evidence. This is including homologous genes and proteins, and these are similarities in genes and proteins that help us to relate to common ancestors. We looked at this before and talked about how if the gene sequences are closer to one another, then it provides more evidence that those individuals or those organisms are more closely related. Examples would be homologous proteins, like a protein called cytochrome C. It's going to be used for cell respiration in many organisms. So cell respiration is essential for making energy, and so it makes sense that this would be something that all organisms have. Homologous genes, an example would be something called Hox genes, which are going to lay out the body and where the arms go and where the legs go. And organisms like vertebrates are going to have a very similar pattern for this, and they're going to have genes that lay out their structure. And so that gives some more support for descent from a common ancestor. The last one will be biogeography. This is going to be a study of where organisms live now and where their ancestors lived in the past. And we look at fossils to kind of see this distribution. There are two patterns. So the first pattern is that organisms are closely related, but in a different habitat. And this is where species, maybe they live on an island and a mainland, and so they have different variations that allow them to survive in that environment. And they have those different variations because those adaptations on the island are better than what they were on the mainland, but they came from a common ancestor. This allows organisms to fill all of the different niches or all the different segments of the environment or the habitat. Closely related but different is going to be an example of divergent evolution or due to divergent evolution, and it will also relate to homologous structures. Divergent evolution or adaptive radiation is the process for single species or a small group to evolve over a short time into different forms. So this is, you have a common ancestor and they become more different. This relates again to homologous structures. This might occur if species migrate to a new environment or if there's extinction of a species, but this occurs so that all of the organisms can fill all the different segments of the habitat that they live in. Here's a picture of divergent evolution. So again, you have a common ancestor and then it branches off from there. The other type of biogeographical evidence or biogeography evidence is distantly related organisms but similar habitat. So similar habitats that are in different locations will have the same environmental pressures, which means that adaptations that are favorable in one environment will be favorable in the other one. So what happens with this is that organisms end up with very similar features, and this would be related to analogous structures. So they all have wings because they need to be able to fly, or they all live in the desert, and so a plant has an adaptation that allows it to conserve water. That type of adaptation, while it might be not exactly the same in two different desert settings, it's going to be similar because it's going to allow the plant to conserve water to be able to survive. This is also an example of convergent evolution, where you have different ancestors converging and becoming more similar. Again, convergent evolution, so this would be groups evolving in different places and at different times, but in similar environments. And so this leads to organisms that have similar traits and similar adaptations. It relates to analogous structures because they have the same function, but a different ancestor. And so, again, this common environment is what leads to convergent evolution. An example of that would be these animals that are very similar despite the fact that they don't necessarily live in the same place, but they develop similar traits based on where they live. Convergent and divergent evolution. Convergent evolution is going to be on the right, where you have two organisms, two parent species that converge to become more similar over time. And then divergent evolution, you have the same common parent species, but then they get more different over time instead of more similar like with convergent evolution. The last thing that you can write down is about artificial selection. This is going to be outside of natural selection. This is how we selectively breed organisms so that we get the desired traits. So this isn't based on the traits that they have, but this would be looking at, how a wolf would diverge into many different species of dogs, but this occurs due to selective breeding based on the traits humans desire. So if you have any questions, please let me know and we can talk about it in class.